So I'm glad to be back, and huge thanks to Herb and Kay for doing excellent prep work. I'm just sorry that I missed what you had to facilitate, because I think I would have learned quite a bit. I don't know if we want to circle back a little bit or if we're ready to go forward here. This is the first week where we're actually reading, 1 Corinthians slowly. So I want to see where we are. You want to start here with 1 Corinthians. Maybe the
question we couldn't answer last week. You always leave the hard one for you.
Because we went over stuff last week.
Say again?
I said we went over things that we had covered before.
Okay, if I think of it, I'll interrupt.
Well, and I do want to commend to you, based on the last 2 weeks. The first week, the author suggested a book that I've almost finished. It's called The World That Shaped the New Testament. So if you enjoyed reading the very brief sample about Gnosticism or different sects of Judaism, like the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the people of the land, the book goes into a lot more depth without being pedantic. So it's accessible. It's about 140 pages, so not awful. Gives you a really great history from the time of the exile all the way up to basically the middle of the Roman Empire. And again, I'll have that next week for loan if you want. I've got like 10 pages left. I didn't finish it, but it was really, see, it's in chapter 1, one of the resources for reading.
Okay.
It's called The World That Shaped the New Testament by C.J. Ritzel. And again, I have it, so I'll have it next week to lend if anybody wants it. But it's a good partner for the last 2 weeks. I've found it to be accessible anyway. If you think of anything, all of this is going to tie together. But maybe the first question I wanted to bring to you was not in the reflection; it was in the research. And I don't necessarily want to default on whether you look this word up or not, but the 1 Corinthians, Paul addresses this to the saints. And I was just wondering kind of what you made of that. Who are the saints, and how do you understand that term? What are their characteristics, and how does that relate to us, if that makes sense?
Well, I just think the dictionary is a person acknowledged as holy or virtuous and typically regarded as being in heaven or death.
Can I press you and ask what holy means to you?
I think of holy people as people who have God as their focus, and their focus is strongly on doing that.
Thanks.
But I mean, that's probably somebody else might be different.
Yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of times we use words, particularly in church, and it's a common word, but we can hear them differently nuanced. And I'm wondering if anybody else has color to that, not because you're wrong, but to see kind of where that lands, because that shows up right out the bat.
Well, I grew up in a Protestant background, and Protestant, so I learned that Protestants have a different definition of saint than the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church, we call the saints, and then you have beatified and I think miracles and things such as this. So very few people are saints in the Roman Catholic Church. Generally speaking, when you see people, maybe more evangelical church going around, saying brother or saint or something like this, they're just referring to all believers in Christ.
So how do you hear this letter being addressed? When this is addressed to the saints in Corinth, what does that kind of do for you?
That all the believers in church, not 1 or 2 people, but all.
Well, I mean, keep in mind, right? It's a written letter, but remember, this is read aloud. So there's people in the room. and it's being read to the people in the room, and it's to the saints. And it occurred to me, like I grew up in an evangelical tradition, and one of the teachings I still remember is either you're a saint or you ain't. It's one or the other, right? And one way to hear the letter is that there's people in the room who ain't saints, and in some ways they're being called out. But I think another way to hear this, because right out the gate we're hearing they got a unity problem. Paul's saying you're all saints, and as a result of your sainthood, you need to work on being unified, right? Like the problem isn't that some of you are and some of you aren't. Since you all are, use your saintliness to work this out.
So he wasn't just addressing them like title, he was trying to remind them of responsibility.
I think we've got options, but I hear him trying to remind them of who they are, whether they know it or not.
I'm gonna just raise my hand here and say, where does it say it's to saints? Because
Yeah, and you know, this is where a translation might affect, right?
That's what I'm wondering.
Chapter 1, verse 2. Read your first couple of verses of chapter 1. That would help us.
Okay, Paul called to be an apostle of Jesus Christ through the will of God, the brother of Sosthenes, to the church of God which is at Corinth, the invited and holy ones who are sanctified by Jesus Christ, and to all of them in every place who invoke the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, both theirs and ours. Is it the holy ones?
It is.
The holy ones is where my Bible would say call to be saints.
Yes.
Instead that.
Okay,
And it's helpful because those words are synonyms. They're not in English, but they are in Greek.
okay, thank you.
So I kind of see it as being like called to be set apart. It's almost like, hey, you guys are saints, why don't you act like it?
Paul's right.
Yeah.
Like God had a special purpose for y'all, why don't you act like it? Instead of doing all those.
Seems pretty fair with where he's getting ready to go, right?
Listening down.
Which is a good reminder that, hey, sometimes I think we do think of saints as being like almost unattainable sheroes or heroes, like those are the models, but that in fact, we're all called to be holy, and the question is, how do we respond to that call? To your point, Herb, you know, the Roman Church has two categories of saints.
Do that.
We often don't know this, but they have canonized saints. Those are the ones who were beatified, and what that means is a miracle. 3 miracles have been verified through their raiment or their home. And that's how you know they're in heaven, because they're working miracles. But they do have everyday saints too. They're just not canonized. Now, in the Episcopal Church, we recognize saints as living or dead. So you can be a saint and alive. Usually what it means is you pointed someone else to God. And we have people in the saint book who aren't like traditional kind of Christian folk, like John Muir. I don't know if you know much about John Muir. His father was a minister, but John Muir said, I'd rather be in the mountains than in church, because that's where God calls to me. So that's actually a monastic kind of Celtic understanding, non-traditional church, but he's in our book of saints. And so are Baptists and Catholics, and Gandhi shows up in there too, who, by the way, wasn't Christian. So we recognize different folk, but we don't put folks on the Saints' Day based on miracles worked after their death. So we don't do it that way. We look at folks who have pointed people to God, right? And usually it happens posthumously that you get a Saints' Day. Your Saints' Day is always the day you died, not the day you were born. That's when you enter larger life, is when you die. But to be fair, we do this at All Saints every year. Like, there's saints in my life who are alive, and I think we get a little wary, like, but what if they mess up? Like, let's not call them a saint till they're dead, because what if they what if they recant or bust up, right? But I think the reminder is like faith, hope, and love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, self-control, that those are irreversible things. So even if you get cranky later in life, that doesn't undo the virtue you did earlier, right? The virtues are undoable. So like my mom's a saint, and she's very much alive, and I hope that continues. And like, look, if she converted to the Wicca cult and, you know, started sacrificing goats in the lawn, I don't think that would take away from her saintliness for me, because like the virtues it's incontrovertible. I don't know if that makes sense. And the holiness piece is really important, right? Because a lot of times we define holy as perfect, but Casey, you said holiness, you used the phrase set apart, which is good, right? I mean, like set apart, like in your home, if you have china, most people I know who have china, they don't use it every day. You use it for like a special occasion, right? And I even have like regular glasses, and I have wine glasses, and I have nice wine glasses, right? Like I've got like 3 kinds. And when I use the nice wine glasses, it's because I want to set the evening apart, right? So it doesn't mean you're set apart like you're special and totally different and better than. It's that there's a grand occasion here. And maybe that's a good way to think about set apart for a grand occasion, instead of you're set apart, so you better do these following things. I don't know if that makes sense. Set apart for a grand occasion, like God's kind of party. Instead of set apart to obey or else. These folks are missing the party. Right? They're missing the party because they're having their own parties. And they're not doing it together. I don't know if that's helpful at all. I wanted to start there, though, because the first question we got are, in the reflection, rivalries and divisions continue to plague the church. And I wonder, what are the most disturbing conflicts for you?
In church or just in life?
In church, rivalry and divisions continue to plague the Church of Jesus Christ. What are the most disturbing conflicts for you?
The women can't be ministers in some churches. I'm blissfully ignorant of other problems, but that.
Yeah. Thank you.
I put racism because I saw it this weekend, and it's so close. That was the first thing that came to my mind.
Yeah.
Can't believe it's still around.
I believe it.
Mm.
Christian nationalism, homophobia.
Yeah. Thank you.
The lack of
Separation church.
inclusiveness. The
Again,
lack of inclusiveness.
lack of inclusivity. Herb, would you?
Separation of church and state kind of issue.
Is that similar to Christian nationalism? Maybe.
Yeah, I think so.
Tolerance,
Mm.
or intolerance, I should say.
Yeah.
I put a strange one, I think, in some ways, but I put some of those as well, but it really bothers me in church to hear other denominations being belittled.
Mm.
Because I think in their own ways, those people are following God in their own way.
Mm.
And so, I think we work very hard sometimes to be inclusive of Jewish people or people that are not in our church. But you'll turn and say something really bad about another church next door,
Mhm.
rather than we should, and maybe that's inclusiveness, I don't know, but that really bothers me.
Is that hypocrisy?
I don't know. I mean, I think it's a hard thing, like sometimes the people you're most critical of are the ones you're closest related to. Right? Anybody else in a family in the room? Sometimes it's a lot easier to accept somebody who's not in your family because they don't know better. But your family sure should know better, right? Right? I mean, by the way, the New Testament's full of that. Like the Pharisees get called down a lot, not because they're the worst folks, probably because they're the closest folks, but they're just missing a little bit. Donna, I think that's really, really fair. And probably that happens. That's probably a big issue. Yeah. Not just for us, but I'd say that's kind of an omnibus issue.
Can I tell you a story? I came to Houston in 1980 when Philip and I got married, and we lived over here in Salt Lake City. Those apartments right there behind off of El Camino and Nassau Road 1. this was the closest. I was raised Anglican my whole life. This is the closest Episcopal church. I came over here and not one person in this church spoke to me. Not one person spoke to me. And I walked out of the left church. The priest didn't even bother to say, well, welcome or whatever. And so I vowed I was never coming back to this church ever again in life, because I didn't feel welcome. No one, I mean, you know, I looked around and there was no one who looked like me,
Yeah,
but still, you know, I would figure, go to a new church, someone will say hello to you. It was obvious I knew the service because I'd done it my whole life. So I went to another church, stayed there for 35 years, and what happened, and I came over here for, Ash Wednesday, because they started doing the drive-through, and I was not having it. It wasn't for me. So I came over here and I got my ashes. Father Mike was the priest then, and I didn't come back for, I guess, till the following Ash Wednesday. He remembered me. He said to me, he says, "Oh, it's nice to see you again." And I said, "How do you remember me?" And he said, "You came last year for ashes." And of course, me being me, I made a little smart remark, you know, well, I guess you would remember me, and many black folks in this church anyway, so, you know. And so when I decided to change, I came back here, and at no point in time did I feel not welcomed, because it was a whole different set of people, you know, and it was a whole different priest, you know, and I've baptized two of my grandchildren here in the 5 years I've been
Yeah,
here, whatever. And, you know, I've got my friends coming, you know, because they feel included. Renee isn't here, but she hasn't stopped talking about you since she came. And she came with her daughter to church a couple of Sundays ago. And she's just, you know, everyone that comes here, they feel like they're included. You don't feel ostracized, you know. And I make jokes about being, you know, being the only black person in the church. I'm not, but you know, I always tease him. I say, yeah, you ain't seen this many black folks in this church. And so we had the last baptism. It was like 4 rows of
yes,
back there, you know.
yes.
Everybody in the church spoke to all of my family and friends, you know. So as for feeling included, I think we at St. Thomas really practice what we preach, you know. And so I'm still here. I don't plan on going unless you throw me away.
Thank you. But I would also tell you, I do struggle with some of the things that they're struggling with here, right? Keep in mind what they're struggling with. I follow Apollos, I follow Paul, I follow Jesus, right? And I think, you know, what Andy Doyle has this phrase that unity and uniformity aren't the same thing. And I wonder if that isn't part of the rivalry and division, is that we mistake uniformity with unity. And I will say I'm critical of traditions that make that mistake, because that's what raised me. And in some ways, like, don't accept me. It's hard not to be accepted by the church that raised you. It's hard. I could probably be less critical, but I find myself in these places too, right? I mean, that's really, like, it's deeply wounding. Or to be married to somebody who perceived that they were called to ministry, but she didn't have the proper genitals, so her church said no. So what did she say? To hell with you. So this is why she doesn't go anywhere, because people say, well, you could just become one of those other ones. And she said, it's not worth it. I can't just change how I was raised. And like, that's I think part of what we find ourselves in. Right. And we're going to see gender show up here. We're going to see sexuality show up here. We're going to see politics show up in this letter. Right. So in some ways, this is really analogous to us. And I love the idea that unity doesn't equal uniformity. And I also have really strong convictions that make that hard sometimes to be fully inclusive, if I'm honest. I shared with the vestry last night. I was at the cathedral in Louisville, Kentucky. And they've got these wall sconces, and the wall sconces have these little nameplates under them, and there's like 40 of them under each sconce, and there's 8 sconces. And I thought, oh, it's a capital campaign. I didn't even pay attention. And towards the end, I looked at it and each plate was a city, a date, how many injured and how many killed. Every mass shooting in the United States this year was in their cathedral. And there's more than 300 of them so far. And the visual of that was overwhelming. And what's funny is some people would see that and say, that's why we need more guns. And I look at that and say, this is crazy. And so maybe I am in a rivalry and division because I don't think I should have a gun in church. I don't think I should.
I don't think anybody should.
But I understand that some people disagree because they think the gun protects other people in the room. And so I just want to be honest, they're not any different from us. There's probably division on that issue in this room. I know there is in our congregation. I don't think that's bad. How we navigate it's really hard, right? You're welcome to your own opinion. We disagree, but we have to be in the same room and you may have a gun and I don't feel comfortable with that. Or you may not have a gun and I wish you did. You know, like that's, you say that's not the gospel, but that's our life. So I think it's important to have compassion on these folks because I don't know that we're necessarily doing better globally, you know, I don't know. You know, in the Episcopal Church, not every church is open and affirming.
Nope.
And I'm going to be honest with you. I try to leave room for that. And it's hard for me to leave room for that. It's hard because the reason I'm Episcopalian, number one, is that we're open and affirming as a tradition. So like, that's why I did this. And and you're against that, especially if you're a clergy. Lay people I'm fine with. But when you're a clergy person, that's hard for me. So rivalries and divisions. Yeah, I think this is us still.
The one thing I struggle with is like, if someone tells me what church to go to, I kind of judge it based on how close, like, okay, like Methodist, Lutheran, okay, but then you get down, okay, I go to like San Leon Cowboy Church or, you know, God forbid Scientology or, you know, something like that. In my mind, I kind of cast judgments and aspersions on that people. Just kind of, and like kind of hierarchically rank it by what's closest to my view, you know what I mean? And what I'm least threatened by, I guess. So that's something I struggle with.
I mean, I would tell you, I think we're probably evolutionarily hardwired to do that. Like, I think that's part of our DNA because that served us well as a survival technique a long time ago. And our brains haven't gotten over that. But maybe this is an opportunity to say like, okay, given that we've got that hard wiring, how do we handle that? Because the truth is, right, if I'd been raised in Saudi Arabia, I'd be Muslim. You would too. I mean, we'd like to pretend we wouldn't, but you would, right? I mean, you would. If you'd been raised in India, you'd likely be Hindu. I mean, you just would, right? Because that's what you know, right? That's where your roots are. And I can be critical of Mormons, but I also can say, man, Mormon people do some great things in the world.
Yeah.
And so maybe that's it when I find myself critical, like, okay, I don't like these parts and that's not going away, but what can I find?
I have a hard time with I guess I'm being critical with, I don't know, in the islands, they call them jumper churches or the Baptist church. I don't know what they call them here in the States where folks shout and scream in church.
Pentecostal.
Pentecostal. Okay. And then they start all this speaking in tongues or that. I am very uncomfortable. I was in the church once and they started that and I just kind of skulk it out of there. You know?
And charismatic Christianity is the only kind of Christianity growing in the world. Not kidding. The two traditions that are growing worldwide are the Mormon Church. They grow 10% every year on average. Not charismatic, by the way. And charismatic Catholicism, charismatic Anglicanism. African Anglicanism is very charismatic.
Well, so do they shout and scream and allegedly speak in tongues and do all that?
Some mixture of that, yeah. Some mixture of that.
Is that the snakes too?
No, that's just in southern Kentucky, right? I mean, the snake handling, yeah, that's pretty geographically limited. Yeah, and even in snake handling churches, that's not like every week. That's
Snake handlers.
Oh,
but we often forget though, but you have to get right, like in parts of the world, right, that's a charismatic Christianity demonstrates that God is physically embodied and accessible. And we just do that cognitively. But in other places of the world, like that's real important. No, I'm talking about speaking in tongues and getting, when the ghost got you and that sort of thing, right? I mean, like it's physically powerful. And something we don't realize is that early Christianity was full of that. You're going to hear that in this letter too. People speaking in tongues and going on and on and on. Spiritual gifts you're going to hear about. And spiritual gifts aren't like, I run a tight ledger. That's my spiritual gift. No, it's like charismatic forms of Christian, like healing people through prayer. Like
Where
physically
comes
healing.
from, like, is it charisms, like gifts or whatever?
Yeah, that's going to show up in this book.
Well, don't some spiritual gift evaluations have speaking in tongues
They do.
as one of your?
We'll talk about those evaluative tools when we get there. It's an interesting idea we got to do that. We're going to evaluate what spiritual gift God's given you with an intellectual plan we've devised. That's an interesting thought, that. I guess you already know how I feel about it. Sorry.
Not what we're here thinking, what night are we gonna do that?
Yeah, no, that's coming in like 7 weeks.
I don't get it. Interpreter. I don't know whether it's real or whether it's just people just mumbo jumbo, just performing, I mean, I just don't know. I prefer to have what we have here, I mean, every now, I mean, I don't mind, you have non-denominational churches, we've got, the different music and the gospel music is different. What I like that and whatnot, but I just don't need nobody jumping up and down next to me in church because, you're liable to jump and then, it's, I mean, it's unnerving for me. I don't know.
Yeah.
Nice to meet you. It is to meet you.
Eight-
Why there's so many denominations and,
Pardon me?
I can guess why there's so many denominations is,
Yeah.
we all
I could-
gravitate to what we do like.
And I would, has anybody here gone on a Curcio weekend before?
Yes.
So Curcio is a little more open that way. There's not necessarily rolling on the floor, but it's more open, right? And I'll tell you what's interesting. A lot of people that I know, Curcio kind of saved their spirituality because it was a little more open than they were used to. It was more emotional. It was more relational, right? I mean, we're not, as Episcopalians, like known for those things.
So wait, what is it?
A Curcio is a spiritual renewal weekend. It kind of came out of the Roman Catholic tradition, but we've like appropriated it in the Episcopal Church. They still have them once a year at Camp Allen. You can go. You essentially show up on like a Friday and you stay through Sunday afternoon and you bunk, and they have like, not lectures, but they call them rollos, which are like talks from lay people about how they found like deeper spirituality. And I'll tell you, honestly, having grown up evangelical, it was like the liturgical church trying to be a little more evangelical is how it felt, which was I was running away from. So Curcio was like, had me really scared. But Episcopalians found it very salvific because it was emotional and like vulnerable and open to like the spirit, which is not a thing we normally say around here, right? So I'm not calling it out. It speaks to different people in different ways. And a lot of people have found it very renewing. Again, it's not rolling on the floor,
No,
but
I
it is,
know.
but it is a little more open. And what's interesting is if you went to a more charismatic church and you weren't moving along with them, it would disturb them. Because they'd be like, why are you sitting still? Like, you've hardened your heart against the spirit.
Yeah.
So it would disturb you for that to happen next to you, and it would disturb them for you to be, I hope that makes sense.
Well, thank God for the Episcopal Church.
You feel, I've been to those Pentecostal fringe and
Mhm.
full Pentecostal sites, and you felt like if you didn't speak in tongues or show signs of You feel ostracized.
But that happens everywhere. Like if somebody got up in, I don't know what you're used to, but like if during the sermon, if someone was like, preach it,
Yeah.
Yeah.
you might be like,
Go on, Pastor.
Yeah.
oh,
Go on, Pastor.
right? I mean, that might be, you might look at that person, whereas that could be very normal and encouraging dialogue, right? I mean, it just kind of depends where you're from.
I don't think that would bother me.
But see, and in church, though,
Context, context, context. That's right.
Church that,
They do.
where I've come from for the last
Preach it, wait,
early
they
2000s.
wait for the word.
We had somebody come into the church one time and they felt very uncomfortable because nobody had a Bible.
Yeah.
And it wasn't a church, you know, I've been to churches where everybody walks in and they've got
Their own Bible.
And they take notes, you know, and that just, I mean, now a lot of people were taking notes, but nobody had a Bible. except the
Yeah.
minister.
Thanks. And by the way, we have them on the pews. But people don't open them because we printed in the leaflet. In the churches I grew up in, you had your own, like mine's embossed. This is like 25 years old, this one. And you did bring it every time, you did. And that was in some ways like, people say it's a non-liturgical church. There's no such thing. Every church has a liturgy. Every church has a liturgy. Part of our liturgy was you brought this every time you went, and I took notes in the margins. And we tend to not to do that. Not because it's wrong, we just tend not to do it.
Our first Sunday here, just a few months ago. First thing I noticed, I turned to my wife and said, no one's carrying a Bible. What's going on here? So, anyway, so yeah, it's a lot of tradition and a lot of just a custom, custom, if you will.
Yeah.
Whereas if you walked into my faith tradition, more evangelical, and you didn't have the tools, then you're not part of the group. You're not, studying the Bible, if you will. So it's interesting how those play out. And it's custom, it's tradition,
Mhm.
and a lot of these things, we don't know why we do them now. And that's part of the interesting thing. I said to Mike when we visited, it's interesting, my faith, tradition, Southern Baptist. Low church, we have two ordinances, we can't even call them sacraments. we
Right.
call them ordinances. And the Episcopal Church has an encyclopedia of what they're about, so it's fascinating, it's awesome, and I appreciate that, but it's just different.
Yeah.
It's hard to see. And I was thinking earlier when you're saying, when I was a child, I would go to Louisiana for the summer. Half the time just visit with grandparents, half the time in a Catholic church. The other half I'm in a Pentecostal church. So I'm just totally confused all the way. None of it makes sense. And I hear my grandfather, who is a saint, that person I think about every day. The first time I heard him speaking in tongues, I was pretty sure he was unbalanced. I mean,
Yeah.
something was wrong.
Yeah.
And but it's fascinating. And we talked about it afterwards, and I began understanding that, and one of the things I'm sure we're talking about is in the gift of tongues, someone, with your speaking, someone understands, but yet there, no one understood.
Mhm.
And he didn't know what he said. So it just, and when they're baptized, it's again, there's so much custom and pressure. When they're baptized, they are supposed to come out of the water speaking in tongues, or I don't know, didn't catch, didn't
Yeah.
take, or whatever.
It hasn't been out long enough.
Yeah.
Well, you actually gave us the perfect segue to question 2. You did. What significance do the cross of Christ and baptism have for the church's present disunity? I almost wish they'd put the Lord's Supper in there too, because the one thing you can't do with a different denomination is have communion. You can do it.
Can you do it here? If you're
Well,
not
everybody's
here?
invited here,
Yeah, I ain't done it here. I thought, oh, no.
but
It's
I'd tell you,
another stuff.
if we had like an area ecumenical gathering where like the Lutherans and the Catholics and the Episcopalians and the Methodists and the Baptists, we all got together, the one thing we're not going to be doing is having communion.
Yeah.
We're not ever doing that at an ecumenical gathering because we all have different kind of,
Yeah.
I don't want to say they have different rules. Some of us have rules, and some of us has traditions, and then some of us have anti-traditions. If that makes sense. So I almost wish they'd mentioned that, but like baptism is a great example, right? And Paul calls it out right in the beginning. Some people are saying, essentially, I'm higher in the community to you because my baptism was more real than yours because it came from so and so, not from such and such. And you'll meet folks that'll say, "Oh, I was baptized by the bishop." That's a dying tradition in the Episcopal Church, actually, because now the dioceses are so big, people don't know the bishop. I mean, most people would rather get baptized by the priest with whom they have a relationship than the bishop with whom they don't. That's been my experience here. But that weren't true 50 years ago. 50 years ago, you wanted the bishop to do it because the bishop was like a higher plane up from the parish priest.
And then when you're baptized as an infant, you don't know anything about it except what you've been told.
And I'll tell you, having grown up in a tradition where we only baptize adults, I was 10, we were very derogatory. Oh, they've christened. We wouldn't say baptized, we'd say christened. Or we'd say, well, they splashed water on the baby. Or they sprinkled, but that wasn't baptism because that's full immersion. It's for adults. Let me be clear. I was 10. There's nothing adult about a 10-year-old, but that's what we said. But this is just proof of the point, right? And I grew up in a tradition even before that one, where if you weren't baptized, it didn't matter what your faith was. If you weren't baptized and you died unbaptized, you were going to hell forever. That wasn't the Southern Baptist Church. And I'm not gonna, for them it was a mark of obedience. And so, like, if you didn't do it, you were being disobedient, and hence you were going to get what you deserved.
But being in the Baptist club, you had the immersion in public. That's the condition, and if you sprinkle, that's not, and again, the Greek, from what I've read, we're not even sure what baptism, whether it was water pulling the head or immersion, and there's no idea from the text, original text, exactly what that is. So it's mind-boggling that we can make that call now, rather this or that, and one matters, one doesn't. And
I think it comes back to, and if I'm honest, I'm going to indict myself here. I think we're just so afraid we're going to get it wrong, and therefore, you got to do it this one way, and then we'll know we got it right. We just have a hard time living with ambiguity. And different traditions handle that anxiety in different ways. So, like, the one way to handle is if you know you went under the water, you're good. Or, hey, if the priest said the right blessing, that worked. Or, we just handle that ambiguity in different ways. But, like, even in the evangelical, and I think that's pretty universal for evangelical. I heard this as a kid. If you don't remember the day in which you prayed the sinner's prayer, it didn't count. So you had to, like, gosh, I don't remember. Was it Friday or Thursday? I'll just pray it again to make sure I get it right. Because, there's high stakes if you don't get it right. And that's not unique to that tradition. We all worry about making sure we get it right. There's a lot of ambiguity in living, right? It's nice to have peace and comfort.
Exactly.
But I think that does introduce, right, to some disunity. I think it does. But I do want to point out, we're a sacramental church. Like we hide sacramental. But my read is that baptism is less important than the gospel. Out the beginning here. I don't know if y'all read that.
What does this say about apostolic succession? It's like, maybe that's not a big deal, it's who they get.
Yeah, does everybody know what apostolic succession is?
Nope.
Apostolic succession is a real tight Roman doctrine, and we share it. That says, in this case, Bishop Doyle has like a family tree. That the Bishop Doyle was made a bishop by Bishop such and such, who was made a bishop by such and such. back all the way to Peter to Jesus. There's like a family tree, and this is on his wall, right? With the understanding that there's this direct line of ordination or passing on the power that goes all the way back to Jesus. That's the idea of apostolic succession, an unbroken chain that goes all the way back to the Lord. Keep in mind, you know, Paul wasn't baptized by an apostle, as far as we know. Ananias, I mean, was he a follower of Jesus directly? We don't, I mean, maybe he was baptized by one of the, I mean, we don't know that, right? Paul doesn't go to pains to lay out his apostolic succession.
Wasn't one of these churches in this letter like, oh, this guy came, he'd only heard about John the Baptist, so he hadn't heard about the Holy Spirit yet, he'd set up something.
Yeah, we read that in Acts, where people had only received the water baptism, but not the baptism of the Holy Spirit. Hence, there's the charismatic claim, right? The charismatic claim is you can do the modality and miss the charism. And how do you know you got the charism? You do something different. Speaking in tongues or prophecy or healing. That makes sense. They're trying to resolve the ambiguity of the story, right? Like, how do you know you got a spiritual baptism and you didn't just get wet? I mean, that's one of their questions. So what does it mean to follow Jesus as Lord, serve Jesus as Lord, from the first 17 verses?
Kind of took the, kind of copped out, I used just Luke 9:23. Be a follower, disciple, deny yourself. Pick up your cross and follow daily, follow today. That's pretty much. The good news there is that it's every day, so one of those days I miss, so you get a chance to do it the next day. But it's that follow, it's that, I mean, Christian means Christ-like. So, you know, every day is a chance to be Christ to somewhere in life. Someone you need today. I think that's, because there was a point where Jesus said, take care of my widows, take care of my orphans, and okay. You know, Paul said it's by faith alone. So we had all of this other stuff to follow. Again, I just make sure we get it right. Pile all this stuff that just probably wasn't there. It wasn't there.
But why did you start by saying you thought that was a cop-out?
Well, it's just an easy, it's, you know, follow, you cannot get your head around Christ line, right? The Christian, that is a 24-hour, 24/7. That's something I'm not capable of. But that verse in Luke, yeah, that gives me the opportunity to follow. It means to emulate, and I get a chance to do that every day. By taking up the cross, and my cross is taking up the, in my opinion, no commentary, probably could be well faced, but it means to remember who I am, that I'm set apart, that I'm sanctified, and that my job is to emulate Christ today, and that's what I use in that question.
Can I push this one more time?
Absolutely.
Because I think you said it's not doable, but you're meant to do it. And I just want to ask you, why isn't it doable to be Christ-like?
You know, I think somewhere in the trench, and again, this is my commentary, which is way on, but I think in the first century, we had it right. We believers call themselves the way, because it is a path
it's a journey.
Mhm.
There's no, there's no end. And there's no right or wrong. I mean, it's something we do every day. You know, and so the way I think we lost something, for instance, there's a big deal in a lot of Protestant denominations where we actually debate, can we lose when we have been set apart? Can we lose that? What do we have to do?
Mhm.
And you think, well, wait, hey, I'm clearly missing something. This is a gift I can't earn. It's freely given. God loves me. How do I lose that?
Mhm.
You know, with the omniscient, omnipresent being, how do I make that call? So anyway, I believe that it's one of those things that it's the way I need to, yes, I need to pray, reflect, meditate, depend on what I missed, the conditions of yesterday, and the way it's forward again, striving for Christ. So that's why I think it's hard. Every day it's hard to get your head about.
Let me ask you, do you see it as attainable or aspirational?
So probably both in, right? And I would tell you, like John Wesley and the Gospel of Matthew both say you can do this. Like they really think you can do this. Matthew says, right, you got to do it. but I think maybe like what that looks like is maybe I'm more with what you just said about the way than the end. I think I grew up with the end of faith looks like this. The end of faith, this is how you know you got there. Instead of, I don't know about the end, but this is the way. Because those are two different things, right? When you get to the end and you're 25, what are you supposed to do? Instead of, well, there's not an end, there's a way. Like we're on this journey. And it does make me wonder, sometimes I think like, I've read the Gospels. Y'all have read the Gospels. Not everybody loved Jesus. Some people are like, I didn't even know what you're talking about. And they walked away. Maybe not everybody thought his jokes were funny. Not everybody thinks my jokes are funny. That's attainable, right? I mean, what if we've kind of set ourselves up for failure by presuming everybody was in love with the man, and they weren't. They weren't. And that doesn't necessarily mean they were terrible sinners. You ever been around somebody really lovable and you just weren't in the mood? I mean, Jesus had moods, right? He had to have moods. Otherwise, he wasn't a human being. So I think aspirational and also attainable, and I've told you this story before in church, and people say this is a ridiculous story, but the best thing about my mentoring rector was that he was who he was everywhere he went. And he wasn't always a good person, but he sure was who he was. And he wasn't embarrassed or ashamed to be who he was. And again, this is like a dumb story, but we were having like a clergy gathering. 3 people were retiring, and there was a meal, and it was like full of people. And the bishop said, okay, we're going to pray. And everybody did this. And that's when my mentoring priest went through the food line. And I said, the bishop was praying, and he was like, he's just a person. I'm hungry. And I thought, like you could say that's inappropriate, but in some ways, he was so in tune with who he was that it was a gift. I mean, it was actually a gift that he was rude in that moment because he was in tune with who he was. And other people could have been offended, but for me, that was like a beautiful story. Like, I wish I could be that in tune with myself, that I would not observe propriety for the sake of meeting my physical needs for a second, because at the end of the day, he's also right. He's just another person blessing a meal that he's going to eat, so I think that's attainable. I think it's attainable. And in some ways it's aspirational. Like I would also like to be considerate, but yeah, I don't know. If,
I struggle with all, everybody knows that, no, but, what does it mean to serve Jesus as Lord? Paul never quotes Jesus, he never talks about abusing Paul. He never referred to Jesus like that. He said Jesus was the gospel for the world, and he was the message. And so what I'm saying is, you read all of the unity, but he doesn't tell them anything about what Jesus meant by love.
Yeah, he only quotes Jesus one time. In 1 Corinthians 11, when giving instructions about the Lord's Supper. The text reads, the night he was betrayed and when he'd given thanks, Jesus broke it and said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And then he makes the quote about the wine as well. This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. So Paul somehow knows these quotes, but those are like the only two.
Sacrifice, but when he just goes to these people and says, do what I tell you to do. I'm now false.
Well,
I mean, I struggle with Paul because I wonder, what was he thinking? I mean, all of a sudden, he goes to the apostles and says, okay, I want it all now. And he takes me on the road and I can see where they all went.
Well, we talked about this a little bit. I remember Paul on the road to Damascus, just outside of Damascus, okay? Jesus talks to him and he loses the sight. He goes into Damascus and God tells Ananias, I think, give him the sight back, and it said that within minutes he was baptized and within a couple of days he was preaching.
mm-hmm.
So where did he learn to preach? Did Jesus reveal that to him outside of Damascus? Because remember, he didn't have the benefit of the gospel.
But what was he preaching? All of his preaching was the same thing, that this is the Jewish Messiah. Christ is, Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. But that's all he preached. He didn't tell him, give him any.
Well, he did, he gave him some new things, that they are justified by faith, which is, so when people heard Paul, they heard things they haven't heard before.
And the big word, right, that we end up getting is that there's only one race, and that's the human race.
Right. That's one of the.
So that's one of his bits. But I think if we'll remember, and this is helpful, I don't want to offend you too much. I don't think Paul's trying to set up an institutional doctrine for all time. I think he's looking at churches he's planted and he's trying to say, look, y'all, just y'all here in Corinth, I see what you're doing and I think you could do better for yourselves. Not better for God. I think you could just do this better. And I'm really frustrated that you guys are having some of these problems, and here are some ways I'd like you to address the problems.
And he sees them as true. If you're baptized, doesn't matter.
Do you think you could just assume that they already know what the deal is? Like, they'll know this part of it, the gospel, but this is,
There has to be some of that.
Yeah.
There has to be some of that, because if there's no Jesus stories floating around, then none of this works. Now, we don't know which ones are known, but apparently enough, right? And
In a few chapters from now, we're gonna hear Paul tell them, you're nothing but infants. I give you milk because you can't handle something.
Yeah.
You don't, you're
Boy,
not ready.
you ever told your teenage kids that? I bet they took it well. So I think it's helpful to hear that, like, he's not always an effective communicator either. I love saying stuff like that, but I know it ain't gonna work. But it feels really good in the moment. I mean, look, if you've been around kids, you've said stuff like that because that's how you feel. So it's good to remember that, like, Paul doesn't have to be flawless to be a holy person, and you don't either.
Well, you said everybody didn't like Jesus. Paul had it worse. So he
Yeah.
goes to Damascus.
Yeah.
Within a few days, he has to leave because they're gonna kill him. And so he goes, well, better go to Jerusalem. Within a few days, they had to hustle into Caesarea to get on a boat to Antioch. And
Yeah.
he lasted there a year, but everywhere he went, remember, Ephesus, Corinth, they were gonna kill him. He ended up.
And look how he starts the letter. I got to tell you, this phrase does a lot of tough things for me. called to be an apostle by the will of God. Now that's tough for me because I've been a part of churches that were declining. And I was part of a church one time, and the pastor kept sending out surveys, kind of, why are we declining? They always came back, it's you. But he knew he was called by God to be there. That's tough, right? Because that can go both ways. I've seen a lot of people do some awful things because God told them to do it. I'm actually real skeptical about people with divine certainty because I've seen it so misused, you know? Like, if people say, like, how do you know you're called to be a priest? I'll say, like, well, I don't know. I mean, I would just tell you, I don't know. I don't know that. I can't seem to get away from it. That was good enough for them. But I do have peers who are like, because I had a vision and the Holy Spirit told me this is what you're supposed to do. And I'm like, whoa, I'm real skeptical of that. But I, in some ways, wish I had that too. You know, like, but because I see this going both ways.
That's what Paul was doing.
He was just a human being, you know, like he was a human being, probably well-intentioned like everybody else, you know?
I don't think he was used to being.
Oh, I mean, he's clearly from the intelligentsia, right? He's literate in multiple languages. He's a Roman citizen. I mean, honestly, like, we're all used to a particular level of educational privilege. Everybody in the room is. I mean, we're not different from that. Particularly if you actually know what you're talking about, it's hard to pretend like you don't know what you're talking about. And we're going to see, I think, as we go through, I mean, the introduction is framing this problem of disunity. And how that's really like the overarching problem. And all of the other things, sexual ethics, spiritual gifts, Lord's Supper, they're going to fall under that umbrella. If we take them out from under that umbrella, it's to our own detriment. This is what Paul's saying. I'm writing to you about sexual immorality as it affects your unity, not so you can codify these sexual mores for all time forever. I'm really worried about this because it's breaking you apart. I don't know if that makes sense. I think if we take it out of the umbrella, he becomes the rule giver and the shame maker. But if we remember, he's calling out aspects that are splitting folk up that don't have to split folk up. Yeah, we can have a little more grace for the guy. I know we're at the end, but I want to tell you one more story if you'll hear it. And it has to do with the way, because I was just at the scout training, and there's these scout guys that do this thing called trek. Have you gone on a trek before?
Yeah.
So trekking is really like scout led, and it doesn't have a clearly defined objective exactly. Like, you're going to hike and you're going to do some terrain, but you're going to have to surmount natural obstacles. And what they were trying to train kids to do is, like, not only do them physically, but have like a good mentality where it's enjoyable. And these guys are like 70 years old, and they're like, I think they're authentic, you know, like it would be like a breakfast and somebody would want to sing some scout song. So I have to stand up, like, everybody stand up. And listen, nobody wants to stand up. And these guys would both say, hooray for standing, like every time they would get up. Or somebody would say, we're going to share with you a story. I love stories. Like, they would just say this spontaneously. And it was like it was so crazy. It was almost infectious. And I heard them talking about the trek. And they said, you know, the worst part about a trek with scouts is when you get where you're going, because that means it's over. And I thought, you know, when you just talked about the way, the worst part is when we get where we're going, heaven, because that means this is over. That's not the best part. That's the worst part, because we get to do this journey, and there's obstacles, and yeah, look, we'll skin our knees, we'll mess up, and that's just part of the trek. And then we got each other to help orient. What if that was how we looked at this? Or even just, what if we looked at it a little bit more? And maybe that's a good lens for where Paul's going to take us, right? There's obstacles. There's obstacles. Y'all can handle them. I'm going to give you some encouragement, but that's part of the fun, is not getting over them, but like doing them. I didn't get that faith life was fun. I got the point of faith life is you go to heaven when you die. It's all about the objective. It's not about the journey. And surely it's at least a both and. And maybe that's a helpful way as we keep reading is like, okay, well, where's the journey part here? Instead of here's the rule, never do this thing ever again. Okay, like where's the journey in that? Okay, I'm looking forward to next week.